At the reading of my husband's will, my stepson whispered, "You're not getting anything. Start looking for a shelter." That day, still dressed in mourning and with a heavy heart, I sat before strangers to hear the last wishes of the man with whom I had shared nearly 20 years of my life. But in the midst of those cold words and official papers, I received a blow that no lawyer could have foreseen. A cruel whisper heavy with contempt that seemed to want to erase my entire history. From that moment on, my life took an unexpected turn. A path where I discovered secrets I never imagined and had to gather a strength I didn't even know I possessed. Today, this is more than a story of loss. It is an account of courage, resilience, and transformation. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The day Douglas passed away felt as if the very structure supporting my life had been torn away. The house, once filled with the sound of his measured footsteps and his quiet breathing on Sunday afternoons, now echoed with a heavy silence. I spent entire days sitting in his armchair, as if the fabric held a bit of warmth I didn't want to lose. Looking at the door and knowing it would never open for him again hurt more than any words could ever express. My body moved out of habit, but my soul felt paralyzed. I remembered every detail of his face, even in the final weeks when the illness consumed him rapidly. There was a quiet dignity in how he endured the pain, and I was proud to be by his side until his last breath. However, when the casket was closed, a part of me wanted to scream, to beg for them to give me back that time. Grief had no order, no logic. It hit me in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes like a tidal wave. Friends and neighbors came to offer condolences, but their words couldn't penetrate the wall that had built up around me. I smiled out of politeness, but every hug was a reminder that I would return to an empty room. Ruth, my closest neighbor, insisted that I eat, and sometimes I accepted, more to keep her from worrying than out of hunger. Even the objects in the house seemed to transform into silent witnesses of an interrupted love. On cold nights, I would curl up in bed, reaching for his side, as if the touch of the sheet could bring back what I had lost. The hours dragged on, and the absence grew denser with each passing day. I didn't know how to move on, and to be honest, I didn't want to yet. The idea of facing the world alone seemed absurd. It was like walking down a long hallway, knowing there was no exit door at the end. Still, the day of the will reading arrived. No matter how much I tried to postpone it, it was scheduled, inevitable. With a heavy heart and slow steps, I walked to the lawyer's office. But what awaited me in that office would be even more devastating. The room was crowded when I arrived, but it felt as though everyone had been there for hours, waiting only for me to begin. Brian was leaning against the wall, talking quietly with Patricia. When he saw me, he forced a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. I sat down at the long table, trying to ignore the weight of the gazes that turned toward me. The lawyer, Marla Jennings, adjusted her glasses and began the reading in a neutral voice, as if speaking of a stranger. Her words floated in the air, but they seemed to lose their meaning before they reached me. With each sentence, a pang of strangeness pierced through me. Douglas had been meticulous in life and had always made it clear that I would be taken care of. But in the document being read before me, my name appeared only once, and in a formal procedural way. The rest was a detailed list of assets and beneficiaries, none of them me. The tightness in my chest grew, a mix of grief and disbelief. I couldn't help but look at Brian, who maintained a serious expression, but whose eyes shone with something that looked like triumph. Patricia kept her hands crossed over her purse as if she were just a polite spectator, but there was a rigidity in her chin that betrayed something more. The lawyer turned the pages slowly, as if each turn were a calculated blow. I tried to remember conversations with Douglas, promises made, looks that confirmed our bond. None of it was there. It was as if the document had been written to erase my existence. When the last pages were placed on the table, no one said anything. The silence was more painful than any explanation. They passed the papers around without even looking at me. As the room dissolved into murmurs, I felt a movement beside me. Brian leaned in, bringing his face close to my ear as if to share a confidence. For a moment, I thought he might offer some kind of comfort, perhaps even an explanation. But the words that came out of his mouth were sharp and cold. "You're not getting anything," he said, almost in a whisper, but with the clarity of someone who wants every syllable to be remembered. My entire body tensed, and it felt as if the floor had given way. Before I could react, He added, even more quietly with a disturbing calm. Start looking for a shelter. I was paralyzed, staring into space, trying to process the cruelty of it. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about being discarded. As if all the years I had dedicated to that family had no value. His expression was one of satisfaction, as if he had just sealed a final victory. The air grew thin, my breath short. Around me the buzz continued, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. A part of me wanted to stand up and scream about the injustice that was happening. Another part, the most wounded part, just wanted to disappear. The pain gave way to something denser, quieter. The certainty that there was much more behind all of this. And that to survive, I would have to find out what it was. Start looking for a shelter, that's what he told me. And he was serious. In the days following the reading, Brian's cold words echoed in me like a persistent hum. I tried to convince myself to accept it and move on, but something inside me refused to be silenced. That morning, I woke up with a fixed idea. I needed to see that will with my own eyes. Marla had left a copy at the office, and after a few insistent phone calls, I managed to get access to the document. When I finally had the pages in front of me, a chill ran down my spine. The paper was heavy, the print sharp, but there was one detail that bothered me immediately. Douglas's signature at the end looked off. I knew his handwriting as well as I knew his voice, and there was something there that didn't fit. It was as if the letters had been forced, a stroke without the natural flow he had even in his most tired moments. I went through every page, analyzing the dates, the initials, any sign that this document was not what it seemed. It wasn't just a feeling. There were subtle inconsistencies, but they were visible to someone who knew Douglas as well as I did. The feeling of being faced with a lie grew, squeezing my chest. I left the office with the copy folded in my purse, my heart racing and my mind on high alert. I knew that if I continued down this path, I would face resistance, and perhaps more enemies than friends. But the doubt had already turned into a necessity. Something about that signature disturbed me. Late in the afternoon, I went to see Ruth. She met me at the door with that attentive look she always had, as if she could sense when my world was about to collapse. We sat in her kitchen, the smell of chamomile tea filling the air. I placed the will on the table, sliding it over for her to see. Ruth took the pages and adjusted her glasses, reading in silence. I watched her expressions change, first concentration, then a slight frown. When she reached the signature, she looked up at me, and her eyes held a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Jennifer, this doesn't look right," she said, her voice low but firm. I explained what I had noticed, detailing how Douglas always signed with a slight upward stroke, something absent in that document. I told her about the dates that seemed misaligned with his final months. Ruth didn't interrupt, just listened, absorbing every word. When I finished, she took a deep breath and placed her hand on mine. "If you believe this isn't real, we need to investigate. It's not just about what was or wasn't left to you. It's about the truth." Her words were like an anchor, keeping me from sinking into insecurity. At that moment, I realized I wasn't completely alone. There was at least one person willing to walk beside me, even if the path was uncertain and dangerous. She believed in me when I was already starting to doubt myself. Armed with courage and suspicion, we decided to revisit the last documents Douglas had signed before he became gravely ill. Ruth remembered that a few weeks before his health worsened, he had finalized the sale of a small plot of land. I asked her to help me find the paperwork for that transaction. We spent hours going through folders, boxes, and drawers. Each opened envelope revealed fragments of a meticulously organized life, which made it even more suspicious that a document as important as the will would have irregularities. When we finally found the deed for the land sale, Douglas's signature was there, clear and unmistakable. I placed the two papers side by side. The difference was stark. On the will, the strokes were shaky, without his characteristic slant. On the deed, even with signs of fatigue, there was a firmness, an undeniable identity. You didn't need to be an expert to see that something was wrong. Ruth leaned in, pointing to the bottom corner of one of the will's pages. "Look at the date." My heart raced. It was impossible to ignore. The document was dated from a period when Douglas could barely sign his own name, much less with that kind of handwriting. There, before me, was the first piece of proof that my instinct was right. and with it, the certainty that I couldn't stop. The date of the change was from after he could no longer even hold a pen. During sleepless nights, I began to mentally revisit every moment I lived with Douglas. When I closed my eyes, I could hear the sound of the newspaper being folded, the clink of the spoon in his coffee, and the peculiar way he adjusted his glasses when he read. They were small memories, but they were full of meaning. However, as I sifted through these details, I noticed gaps I had never questioned. Douglas was reserved about certain matters, especially his family and old business dealings. I had always respected that, believing his silence was just a matter of discretion. Now that silence felt more like a wall built to hide something. Memories that once warmed me began to take on an enigmatic, almost suspicious tone. I recalled a rainy afternoon when he received a letter and, after reading it, immediately put it in the safe. I asked if it was anything important, and he just replied that he was taking care of everything. I never knew what it was about. Maybe back then I didn't want to know. The more I tried to piece together the timeline of the last few years, the more I realized that some pieces didn't fit. The illness, the discreet changes in documents, the frequent visits from Brian and Patricia while I was away. It all seemed to be part of something that had completely escaped me. The past that was once a safe place now revealed itself to be full of closed doors. And I was about to start opening them. The memories were coming back like a broken puzzle. Determined to confront the doubts, I gathered all the documents I still had. My home office turned into an investigation scene. Open folders, stacked papers, notes scattered across the desk. I began comparing contracts, letters, and bank records, searching for any clue that would confirm my suspicions. It was then that I noticed something alarming. There were joint accounts that, until the month before Douglas's death, were active and had a considerable balance. However, on the recent statements, all the funds had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. None of these transactions had been mentioned in the will. Even stranger were the differences between similar documents. In a life insurance policy, Douglas explicitly stated that I was the sole beneficiary. Yet in the will that was read, this information had completely vanished, as if it had never existed. The contradiction was so blatant that anger, for a moment, replaced my sadness. I wondered who would have the power, and the motive to alter such important papers. Brian had access to some documents, but Patricia also maintained close contact with Douglas's lawyer. The web of suspicion grew with each discovery, and I found myself surrounded by familiar faces that now seemed like strangers. The evidence was before me, fragmented but sufficient to confirm one thing. Someone had meddled where they shouldn't have. Nothing matched what Douglas had promised. I decided it was time to directly confront the person who had conducted the reading of the will. I called Marla Jennings's office and, in a controlled voice, asked to speak with her in person. She agreed, but I noticed a hesitation in her pause before confirming the time. I arrived early, determined not to show any insecurity. Her office was immaculate, with dark furniture and a subtle scent of freshly printed paper. Marla greeted me with a formal smile, inviting me to sit. I placed my folder on the desk and, without beating around the bush, mentioned the inconsistencies I had found. Her expression remained unchanged, as if she were trained not to react. I explained about the different signature, the incompatible date, and the contradictions between the insurance policy and the will. She listened in silence, lacing her fingers on the desk, only interrupting to say that all the documents were in order, and that any question should be handled legally. There was a studied coldness in the way she pronounced each word, as if she were dealing with a case of no personal relevance. But her eyes, they gave something away. A flicker of impatience, perhaps even a threat, passed through them before she resumed her neutral tone. I left there with the feeling that I had touched on something she didn't want me to know. And for the first time I realized my fight would be against more than just my pain. She smiled with disdain as if she had already won. After my visit to Marla, I realized I was about to face something bigger than I had imagined. I needed help. Someone with experience in uncovering what hides in the shadows. Ruth, ever practical, suggested I speak with Owen Fisher, a private investigator she had known for years. At first I hesitated. Opening up my life to a stranger wasn't easy, but urgency overcame my reluctance. We arranged a meeting at a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. Owen arrived on time with an attentive posture and a gaze that seemed to read beyond words. He listened to my story without interruption, making only quick notes in a small notebook. His presence conveyed a firm calm, that of someone who had dealt with complex situations before. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "If what you suspect is true, we'll need to be meticulous. Every detail matters, every date, every signature." I felt a mix of fear and relief. Fear because it confirmed the seriousness of the situation. Relief because for the first time I had someone willing to fight alongside me. Owen asked for copies of all the documents, as well as any old papers that could be compared to the will. He also said he would discreetly investigate Marla, Brian, and Patricia to understand the connections between them. I knew this meant stirring up a hornet's nest, but there was no turning back now. As I watched him leave, a certainty stayed with me. He was not the type to give up easily. If there was something hidden, he would find it. A few days later, Owen called, asking to meet me at the same cafe. There was a different glint in his eye, like someone holding a valuable piece of a puzzle. He opened his briefcase and took out a small digital recorder, explaining that he had gained access to an old file stored in a legal storage facility where Douglas kept records. When he pressed the button, I heard Douglas's voice fill the air. My heart pounded. He spoke slowly, as he used to do when explaining something important. He mentioned my name more than once, making it clear that he wanted to ensure I was provided for, in all circumstances, regardless of any family dispute. The words were direct, full of conviction. I closed my eyes, letting his voice envelop me. It was as if he were there, sitting across from me, looking into my eyes to assure me that I had not been forgotten. The emotion hit me hard, but along with it came indignation. How could someone have the audacity to erase this wish? Owen watched my face intently, perhaps to gauge my reaction. "These recordings don't have legal value on their own," he said, "but they can indicate that there was bad faith in the alteration of the will. And that changes everything." I held the recorder carefully, as if it were living proof of Douglas's love and intention. That voice was his, and it was for me. In the following days, I felt something shift inside me. The pain of grief was still there, but now it was accompanied by a spark of determination. Knowing that Douglas had made his wishes clear gave me the strength to face whoever had manipulated the situation. Owen continued his investigation, always discreet, but keeping me informed with every development. Ruth was also tireless. Between cups of coffee and to-do lists, she reminded me that fighting for justice wasn't just about inheritance. It was about preserving the truth. For the first time since Douglas's death, I began to feel that my life was not condemned to be defined by the injustice I had suffered. Owen managed to trace subtle connections between Brian and Marla that went beyond a professional relationship. Unrecorded meetings, after-hours visits, phone calls at odd times. Everything pointed to a veiled agreement between them. We didn't have concrete proof yet, but the outline of the plan was beginning to emerge. Each new discovery reinforced my determination. The feeling of isolation that had suffocated me at the beginning started to dissipate, replaced by an unlikely but solid support network. I no longer felt so vulnerable. At that moment, I realized my fight was no longer a solitary one. I was not alone anymore. Owen called me on a rainy morning, his voice low and direct. "We need to talk in person." I met him at our usual cafe, where he opened a folder filled with statements, records, and notes. "Brian is drowning in debt," he said, sliding the papers toward me. My eyes scanned the columns of figures, overdue loans, collection letters. It was a financial hole he was trying to keep secret. Even more shocking was discovering that, to maintain his lifestyle, Brian was already selling off assets that belonged to Douglas's estate. Cars, antiques, even small properties, all being sold for well below market value. He was moving fast, as if he had a deadline to meet or an impatient creditor at his door. With each document I reviewed, it became clearer that my stepson wasn't just interested in the inheritance out of greed. He needed it to survive. And for that, he was willing to run over any obstacle, including the law. Owen suspected that some of these transactions weren't even being officially recorded, which would make recovering those assets even more difficult. A bitter weight settled over me. The fight I thought I was waging for Douglas's memory and wishes was now also a race against time. Every day that passed meant more irreversible losses. The inheritance wasn't just a moral right. It was the only way to stop him from liquidating everything. My heart raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. Brian was selling what wasn't even his. I decided to confront Patricia. I arranged to meet her at a quiet restaurant, believing that a frank conversation might expose the extent of the problem. She arrived on time, impeccably dressed, with that haughty air she always carried. When I mentioned Brian's debts and the suspicious sales, her eyes narrowed. "That's ridiculous, Jennifer," she said, stirring her coffee as if we were discussing a trivial matter. "Brian has always managed the family's affairs well." The conviction in her tone seemed rehearsed, but there was tension in her hands, which gripped the porcelain cup with excessive force. I tried to argue, presenting some of the evidence Owen had gathered, but she dismissed it all. Patricia not only refused to believe it, she became irritated with my insistence. "You've always been dramatic and now you want to tarnish my nephew's name out of revenge," she accused, her voice firm and laden with disapproval. The coldness with which she defended Brian was almost disturbing. I saw in her more than just a protective aunt. I saw an unwitting accomplice, or worse, a deliberate one. Her refusal to even consider the evidence showed me that her loyalty was not to the truth, but to the image she wanted to preserve of the family. And that image was worth more to her than any justice. I left that meeting with a mixture of frustration and alarm. She defended her nephew with more anger than logic. After the failure with Patricia, I sought legal counsel. A trusted lawyer of Ruth's, Mr. Callahan, agreed to see me immediately. I brought all the documents Owen had gathered and laid out every detail, from the questionable will to Brian's illicit sales. He listened attentively, slowly flipping through the evidence without interruption. When he finished, he rested his hands on the desk and looked me in the eyes. "Jennifer, what you have here is serious. These transactions could constitute fraud and embezzlement. But we need to act quickly, before more assets disappear." The urgency in his voice made my stomach turn. He explained that we could request a restraining order to block the sale of assets, but that every day lost was a day in Brian's favor. Furthermore, the recent financial movements indicated that some of the money was already being transferred to overseas accounts, which would make recovery nearly impossible. I left his office feeling the weight of a new race against time. The fight was no longer just about proving the will was forged. Now it was about preventing everything from being destroyed before the truth could come to light. Owen was right. This battle would require every ounce of my energy. As I walked down the stairs of the building, Callahan's words echoed in my mind. "If we don't act fast, he will destroy everything." After days of silence between us, Patricia contacted me. She said she wanted to clarify a few things, and invited me for tea at her house. The invitation surprised me, but I accepted. Perhaps it was the first crack in the armor she always wore. When I arrived, I found her looking more worn out than usual, her shoulders slightly stooped and her hands restless. We started with small talk, but I soon steered the conversation toward Brian and the illegal sales. This time she didn't respond with attacks. Instead, she pressed her lips together and looked out the window, as if the trees in the garden were more interesting than my questions. There was something different about her, less conviction, more caution. When I mentioned the dubious signature on the will, I noticed her fingers tapping discreetly on the table. It wasn't the reaction of someone sure of her own story, but of someone carrying a burden. Patricia, however, still tried to maintain a firm tone, saying that these things are complex, and that perhaps I was misinterpreting the situation. Even so, the hesitation was there, pulsating between each word. I knew that mannerism. It was the same one Douglas had when he wanted to hide something but knew I had already noticed. The difference was that, in Patricia's case, this hesitation tasted of guilt. Before I left, she promised to think about what I said. I walked away with a certainty. The wall was beginning to crack. She avoided my eyes, but she hesitated. A few days later, I had to go back to Patricia's house to pick up some old documents that, according to her, were still stored in Douglas's office. As I entered, I realized she wasn't alone. The slightly ajar door to the living room let out low voices. I recognized Patricia's and, to my surprise, Marla's. I stood motionless in the hallway, trying to catch their words without being noticed. "She's starting to put the pieces together," Patricia was saying, her voice tense. Marla replied dryly. That changes nothing. We've already taken care to make everything look legitimate. My heart raced. Their tone left no room for doubt. As I listened, the sound of footsteps approached, and I instinctively moved away, pretending to admire a painting. Patricia appeared in the hallway, surprised to see me there before she had called me in. Her eyes studied my face, perhaps trying to gauge if I had overheard anything. Marla emerged shortly after, forcing a polite smile. Jennifer, what a coincidence, she said, but her gaze was far from friendly. The tension between us was palpable, almost physical. I felt that, in that moment, I had touched upon something they did not want exposed under any circumstances. As Patricia led me to the office, I remained silent. But inside, the certainty solidified. There were deeper secrets than I had imagined. They knew I was listening. The next evening, Patricia showed up at my door. Her tired expression and poorly buttoned coat revealed she had made a difficult decision. She walked in without waiting for an invitation and asked for a glass of water. We sat in silence for a few minutes until she sat at the table and began to speak. I didn't want it to come to this, she said, looking at her own hands. Her voice trembled, but there was a weight of relief in every word. She confessed that she knew about the altered will, and had noticed at the time that Douglas's signature was not the same. When I asked why she hadn't said anything, Patricia sighed. Because Brian asked me to. He said it was for the good of the family, that he would take care of everything and avoid conflict. I went along with it. I didn't want the Wallace name to be tarnished. It was the first time she had spoken without a mask, and each sentence felt like a blow. My chest burned, knowing that she, Douglas's sister, had remained silent in the face of such a clear injustice hurt more than any of Brian's insults. It was as if a bridge that had still stood between us had been set on fire. The silence that followed was dense and heavy, but now I knew who I could truly count on, and who I never could. She knew about the forgery, and she allowed it. After Patricia's confession, I began to mentally revisit every moment of Douglas's final months. His pauses before answering, the conversations cut short when someone entered the room, the way he stored certain documents in the safe. Everything now seemed laden with meaning. I realized he had been trying to tell me something, but at the time I chose not to press him. Douglas was always a man who was careful with his words. He never said more than he deemed necessary, but there was a silent warmth in the way he looked at me, as if there in his eyes were messages that never became sound. I remembered one night, shortly before he was hospitalized, when he held my hand longer than usual. "You'll know what to do," he murmured. At that moment I thought it was just for comfort. Now the phrase sounded like a warning. Perhaps he already knew someone would try to distort his will. Perhaps he had left clues for me to find when the time came. The more I reflected, the more I believed the answer lay in overlooked details, in the subtext of our life together. I talked to Ruth about this feeling, and she, practical as always, suggested we start looking in places Douglas used to frequent alone. The office and the library were the most obvious. It was time to stop looking only at memories and start searching for concrete clues. I took a deep breath, with the strange certainty that something was waiting for us. Douglas had left clues, but I hadn't wanted to see them. Douglas's library was his private sanctuary. Dark wood shelves covered the walls, filled with books organized by subject, author, and even size. The smell of old paper mingled with the soft scent of cedar. Ruth and I entered carefully, as if we were intruding on a space still protected by his presence. We started with the desk drawers where we found only routine papers, paid bills, letters from friends, scattered notes. Nothing that indicated anything hidden. Next, we climbed a small step stool to inspect the higher shelves, where Douglas used to keep rare books. As I examined spines and covers, Ruth pulled out a heavier volume with a navy blue cover, which looked like it hadn't been touched in years. When she removed it, I noticed a thin layer of dust only on the top, as if it had been put back recently. Ruth flipped through a few pages, but nothing immediately stood out. Still, something about the way the book stood out from the rest made me uneasy. Maybe it was how it was positioned slightly askew, or the fact that it was between two titles unrelated to it. It was as if it had been placed there with a purpose. I exchanged a look with Ruth, and she nodded, as if she also felt that this object held more than it appeared. Something inside that book drew our attention. We took the book to the central table and began to leaf through it more carefully. The initial pages were ordinary, but as we reached the middle we noticed something unusual. A small, slightly crumpled brown envelope, tucked between two pages. My heart raced. Douglas was not the type to leave things out of place. If that envelope was there, it was because he wanted it to be found. Ruth opened it carefully, revealing a few folded sheets and a handwritten card. The text on the card was brief, almost cryptic. "If anyone tries to change what I have decided, this is for you." I looked at Ruth, feeling a knot form in my throat. Douglas had foreseen everything. Before we could read the contents of the pages, a noise in the hallway made us stop. The sound of footsteps, then silence. I waited for a knock on the door, but it never came. It was as if someone were just making sure we were there. The tension made me hold the envelope tighter. We closed the book and pretended to continue our search, so as not to reveal that we had found something important. Deep down, I knew that what was inside that envelope could change the entire narrative that was being forced upon me. The silence around us seemed denser, as if the house itself were holding its breath with us. There were more truths hidden between the pages. With the library doors closed, Ruth and I turned our attention to the envelope found in the book. The paper was rough to the touch, betraying its age, but it was surprisingly well preserved. I unfolded it carefully, fearing that any sudden movement might damage its contents. There were 2 handwritten pages, in Douglas's unmistakable script. Before reading, I examined it closely. The paper had recent fold marks, and the ink, though intact, showed no signs of aging consistent with the paper. It was as if he had purposefully chosen old sheets to camouflage the real date of the writing. The realization made me shiver. Douglas had left something deliberate, with a clear intention for it to be found at the right time. I looked at Ruth and saw the same recognition in her eyes. This was not a simple memento or a love note lost in time. It was a carefully architected message. I sat at the table, took a deep breath and began to read. The beginning was affectionate but carried a tone of urgency. He explained that if anything happened, I should trust my suspicions and seek guidance. There was no doubt. Douglas knew there could be a manipulation of his final wishes. I held the paper tighter, feeling the weight of the truth approaching. The paper was old, but the ink was recent. The first lines hit me like both an embrace and a knife. "My Jennifer, if you are reading this, it means I can no longer speak to you." The warmth of his voice seemed to echo in the words. He described his love, our life together, and his gratitude for every gesture I had dedicated to him in the years we were together. But soon after, the tenderness gave way to clear warnings. He stated that changes might be made to the will without my knowledge, and that people close to us would try to convince the world that this was his wish. Douglas asked me not to accept anything without questioning it, as he had left proof and trusted people to help me find it. The letter also mentioned names, including Brian and Marla, and insinuated that their intentions had never been pure. It wasn't an explicit accusation, but the choice of words made it clear that he knew of their ambitions. Every sentence I read reinforced not only the injustice of the present, but also the certainty that my fight was the continuation of something Douglas had already begun. He had not remained silent in the face of the threat. He had simply prepared the ground so that I could act. When I finished, tears blurred my vision, but with them came a strength I hadn't felt in months. He wanted to protect me to the very end. With the letter in hand, everything changed. Ruth and I knew that this document not only validated my suspicions, but also dismantled any narrative that Brian and Marla tried to maintain. It was Douglas's voice, preserved on paper, declaring his true will. Owen, upon seeing the contents, was direct. "This is gold, Jennifer. It might not be enough on its own to invalidate the will, but with the other evidence, we'll build a case that's impossible to ignore." We decided then to gather all the evidence and prepare a more aggressive action, including an immediate request to freeze the assets. We also chose to keep the existence of the letter a secret, at least until the right moment to present it. We knew that if Brian found out, he might try to destroy or discredit its authenticity. The document needed to remain secure and far from any interference. From that point on, our investigation gained a new pace. It was no longer just about suspicions and assumptions. We had a centerpiece, the confirmation that Douglas was on my side, even after death. That certainty transformed everything. As I placed the envelope back in my purse, I felt as if I were carrying not just a piece of paper, but the strength of a love that defied even the silence of death. That letter would change everything. I decided I could no longer avoid a direct confrontation. I called Marla's office and requested an immediate meeting. She accepted, perhaps assuming I had nothing new. I walked into her office with the folder held firmly, containing copies of everything we had gathered up to that point. I sat down and placed Douglas's letter, protected by a transparent plastic sleeve, in the center of the table. "Explain this," I demanded. Marla glanced quickly at the document but averted her eyes almost immediately, maintaining her cold demeanor. I tried to capture her reaction, but she avoided any prolonged eye contact. I explained every point. The forged signature, the incompatible dates, the recordings, and now the written proof of what Douglas truly wanted. "Were you a part of this, Marla?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. She remained silent, just lacing her fingers on the desk, as if every second were calculated. The air in the office felt thick. I knew she was choosing her next words with extreme care, and that hesitation only confirmed what I already suspected. I stood up, gathering my documents. Before leaving, I faced her one last time, waiting for some reaction. She refused to look at me. The next day, I met with Owen and the lawyer Callahan to define our next move. Douglas's letter had changed everything. Now we could legally pressure Marla, forcing her to testify. Callahan prepared a formal notice, warning that the case could become criminal, involving forgery and coercion. We knew Marla was experienced and would hardly be shaken by vague threats. That's why Owen presented something even more impactful. Records of her meetings with Brian in discreet locations, before and after the will was altered. There were photos, dates, times, and even financial transactions that raised serious suspicions. "She'll realize we're not bluffing," Owen said confidently. Callahan agreed and that same day, filed the initial legal measures to ensure Marla would be subpoenaed. The strategy was simple: corner her from all sides, making it impossible for her to remain silent. As I followed each step, I felt the scales begin to tip. The impunity they seemed to enjoy was crumbling in the face of increasingly solid evidence. It was only a matter of time before the first piece of the castle fell. Owen had proof she didn't even know about. The summons to testify arrived sooner than I had imagined. On the scheduled day, Marla entered the conference room accompanied by a lawyer, but her face was different, less haughty, more tense. Callahan began the session by presenting the evidence, and with each document displayed, I saw her resistance weaken. When it was time for Douglas's letter, her lawyer tried to intervene, but she raised her hand, asking to speak. She took a deep breath and in a low voice began to admit what she had done. She confirmed that the will had been altered at Brian's request, and that the signature had been reproduced from another document to give it an appearance of authenticity. Marla tried to justify her participation by saying she believed it was to avoid family conflicts, and that she didn't expect it to reach this point. But her words were just faint echoes against the weight of her confession. Owen recorded every detail, while Callahan was already preparing the necessary actions to take it all to court. I, sitting there, felt a mixture of shock and relief. The mask had fallen, and with it, Brian's last defenses. As we stood up, I realized the tide had turned for good. Marla gave up everything and sealed Brian's fate. The day of the trial dawned cold, with a gray sky that seemed to reflect the weight of the moment. As I entered the courtroom, I heard the muffled murmur of the people already in the pews, waiting for the session to begin. In front of me, Brian sat next to his lawyer, his face tense, but still trying to maintain a confident posture. Marla was not in the audience. She had chosen to testify in advance, sealing her part in the story. The judge, with an austere expression, opened the proceedings with a formal presentation of the case. Callahan laid out the charges: forgery, coercion, and embezzlement. With each piece of evidence projected, from the differences in the signature to the financial transactions, I saw the jurors lean in to get a better look. The silence in the room was dense, as if everyone knew they were witnessing something definitive. Owen was called to testify and describe the investigation process in detail, reinforcing each point with dates and records. His clarity and precision seemed to convince even the most skeptical in the room. When the judge announced that I would be heard, my heart raced. I stood up, feeling the weight of all the months of struggle on my shoulders. I walked to the center of the room, glancing briefly at Brian, who looked away. I took a deep breath, ready to tell the whole truth. All eyes were on me. I held Douglas's letter as if it were an extension of my own hands. Callahan asked me to read it, explaining that it was a document left by the deceased himself, capable of demonstrating his true intentions. I opened the envelope slowly, the sound of the paper echoing in the silent room. I began with the first words, my voice cracking, but I didn't allow myself to give in to emotion. "My Jennifer," I read, and I noticed some discreet murmurs from the audience. As I continued, the tone shifted from affection to firmness, revealing the clear warning about possible alterations to the will and the direct mention of those involved. I looked at the judge at key moments, making sure every sentence was absorbed. Douglas's strength was there, intact, supporting me with every syllable. When I finished, the silence lingered for a few seconds before the judge thanked me and asked me to remain seated. In that instant, I realized I wasn't just a witness. I was the bridge between what Douglas wanted and the justice he deserved. The weight of this responsibility, which had once seemed unbearable, now transformed into pride. I closed the envelope and returned to my seat, with the feeling that the truth had finally found its voice. I was trembling, but every word was firm. After hours of deliberation, the jurors returned to the room. The murmuring ceased immediately when the judge asked for the verdict to be read. Considering the evidence presented, we find the defendant, Brian Wallace, guilty of document forgery, coercion, and embezzlement. The words echoed like a final blow against the courtroom walls. I felt the air return to my lungs. Brian, who had maintained a rigid posture until then, let his expression fall. The bailiff approached, and the sound of handcuffs closing on his wrists seemed to seal the end of a long and draining battle. The judge continued, invalidating the fraudulent will and reinstating the original document, guaranteeing me all the rights provided for by Douglas. There was a tone of solemnity in his voice, but also one of disapproval, as if he regretted that the family had reached this point. I looked at Owen and Ruth, who returned my gaze with looks of relief and victory. The weight of months of uncertainty dissolved, replaced by a serenity I almost didn't recognize in myself. As I left the courthouse, I felt the cold on my face, but also a freedom I hadn't felt in a very long time. Brian was handcuffed in front of everyone, and I was finally free. The morning wind had a different taste when I opened the windows of my house. It was the same scene as always, the trees swaying, the birds singing, the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen, but I saw it with new eyes. This home, which for months had felt threatened, was now safe. And, more than a physical space, it was proof that I had endured. In the days following the trial, many people reached out to me, saying they had followed my fight, that they were inspired by my determination. I had never thought of myself as an example for anyone, but hearing those words, I realized that what I had been through wasn't just my story. It was also a reminder that one should not accept injustice as destiny. Ruth remained by my side, faithful as always, and Owen became more than an ally, a friend I know I can turn to for any future battle. As for Patricia, our relationship will never be the same, but at least she now carries the exposed conscience of her choices. And in time, perhaps she will find a path to redemption. Douglas's letter remains stored away, not as evidence, but as a reminder that true love leaves deeper roots than any lie. Sometimes I still reread it, not to relive the pain, but to remember the strength I found when I needed it most. I am no longer just the silent widow they once tried to erase. I am the woman who resisted, who spoke up, who fought, and who now no one will dare to forget. Now, I'm curious about you who have listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Support the channel. Subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that you will also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.